All right. Hey, Daniel, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm excited.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's a pleasure to have you here. For those of you who haven't met Daniel J. Lewis yet, he is an award-winning podcaster. He helps others launch and improve their own podcast shows for sharing their passions and succeeding in business. Daniel also designs websites. He offers one-on-one consulting. He speaks frequently on technology, social media, and theology, and he hosts a network of award-winning or award-nominated podcast shows covering how to podcast and use Audacity, clean comedy, and the number one unofficial podcast for ABC's hit dramas Once Upon a Time and Once Upon a Time in Wonderland. So welcome to the show, Daniel.
Thank you, Tom. I love podcasting, as you can tell, because I'm so involved in it, and that is my business is making stuff for podcasters.
That's awesome. So how did you get started, like podcasting in the first place?
It started by listening to podcasts. When iTunes announced in 2005 that, or when Apple announced, rather, in 2005 that iTunes would support podcasts, that's when I got into it because I heard someone say, "Oh, this is the coolest thing. You got to check this out." So I did. I checked it out. I looked up a couple technology podcasts and I found This Week in Tech and Jesus Geek podcasts. And I actually listened to them through my laptop in my car with the laptop sitting in the passenger seat as I drove because I didn't have an iPod. I'm not even sure if iPods were all that affordable back then. I didn't have any kind of mobile device that could play the episodes. But at one point, I just realized this is really cool. They're using their voice. It's kind of like talk radio, which I enjoyed up until I discovered podcasts. And I realized I could do this. I know how to edit audio. I know how to create a website. I know how to work with WordPress enough to do a podcast. So it was just realizing that I have what it takes to do this, and I had at that time as a bachelor. And thus the idea of the Ramen Noodle Clean Comedy podcast was born, and I launched it in 2007.
That's awesome. So how did you even figure out how to launch your podcast back then?
It was a lot of trial and error, and that's how I work. I don't really read the manual often. I figure things out as I go. So I knew basically how to work with WordPress, and I knew that a podcast was essentially an audio file attached to an RSS feed. So I just loaded up WordPress. I found a podcasting plugin. I worked through it, figured out how to attach my media files that I already knew how to create and edit with Audacity at that time, and uploaded them somewhere. And it was kind of a lot of stuff that I sort of knew already and was just putting together the pieces or learning along the way.
Awesome. That's great. Well, I know there's a ton of information out there online about, how to start a podcast now and, how to set it up with WordPress. And so I don't want to talk about, too much of the basic stuff, but can you kind of give people an overview of just kind of the overall components of what you need just to have a podcast show in the first place?
Well, the first thing you absolutely must have is a message. If you don't have a message, if you don't have that thing you want to share with your audience, then really you shouldn't be podcasting. You need to have a message that you're going to share, and that message needs to be either helpful or entertaining or both. So when you have that message, that's the most important thing, and that's where you need to spend the most time trying to figure out the message. The technology is easy. Yes, it can take some time to set up the technology, but that shouldn't be where you stress out and try to find the perfect microphone for your voice or the perfect website theme or all of that stuff. There are general recommendations, and that is that I recommend you host your website starting out with Bluehost or HostGator, install PowerPress with WordPress on it, host your media with either Blueberry or Libsyn. Blueberry integrates really nicely with WordPress, so if you want something easy, go with Blueberry. If you want something just a little bit cheaper, go with Libsyn, that's Libsyn, and if you use the promo code NOODLE with either of those, you get your first month free. But that then gives you a website, it gives you a podcast RSS feed, it gives you media hosting for your podcast, and it gives you stats. And all you've had to do is set up two services, your website and then your media hosting through Blueberry or Libsyn. Then you publish your podcast episodes like you would publish a blog post, attach the media files to them. Then you get your RSS feed from PowerPress. You take that RSS feed, you submit it to iTunes and other podcast directories, and then from that point on, every time you publish a new episode on your website, which is just a blog post, with an MP3 file attached to it that then automatically syndicates out to iTunes and all of the other podcast directories.
Awesome. Well, that was like the fastest overview of podcasting I've ever heard. I mean, that's amazing. That's and exactly like every step you need is right there. So that's awesome.
Thank you. I do this a lot, if you can't tell.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you've got some great articles on your site about how to do all that as well, right? So we'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. So if you are listening right now, you want to start your own podcast show and figure out all the technical details, Daniel's got a ton of great info on that can help you out. Yeah, so okay, so I want to talk about some more advanced stuff for podcasting because it seems like it's almost like ebooks now where just like every day there's new shows releasing, like hundreds of, it seems like thousands and thousands of new podcast shows being released. How do you stand out from the crowd with so many new shows coming on board?
I just presented this at Social Media Marketing World, and there are several different ways that you can stand out, but the biggest ways will be the quality of your content and how much content you put out. There are plenty of other ways too, and I presented recently in a session 7 different ways that you can make your podcast stand out, but the 2 that I'll focus on right here is the quality and the amount of content you're putting out. Looking at the quality, look at the quality of the podcasts that rise to the top in iTunes. Yes, several of them are NPR, where there's this whole staff of writers and researchers and producers and hosts, all with professional backgrounds in this. Yes, they stand out because they have such high quality. But you don't have to have a whole team in order to get high quality. If you look at the top podcasts in iTunes, you'll also see people like Pat Flynn or John Lee Dumas or Michael Hyatt or Eric Fisher. You'll see podcasters who are just doing this solo. They record it themselves, they edit it themselves, they prepare it themselves. They may present the content solo, they may present it as an interview, but what they're focused on is high quality content first, then high quality presentation of that content, then high quality production of that content, making sure that people can hear well, that the sound is audible enough, it's loud enough, meeting good sound standards, and also they promote that high quality content well. So it's all wrapped up in the quality. If people come to a podcast and they don't hear quality, and I'm saying quality even beyond just the production quality, if they don't hear quality content, they won't stick around. In fact, it's the content quality that usually hooks people in. Like, think of your favorite TV shows. If you follow them religiously, you start watching it and you're hooked in because of the storyline, most likely not because you know a certain person is an actor in that TV show. But when you get into the TV show, then you start to care more about the characters, about the actors. You start to dig into it. It's because of that hook of the high quality content in the beginning. So that's one big way to stand out. There is so much low quality content in iTunes and other podcasts out there that it really doesn't take a lot of work to stand out, but it does take some work. If you feel like you can just come up to the microphone and ad lib and just say whatever's on your mind, that doesn't usually produce high quality content. Some celebrities with massive followings have tried to do that, and even with their celebrity status, their podcast hasn't caught on because they weren't providing high quality, helpful, and entertaining content. So that's the first way to stand out. Second way is the amount of content you release. This doesn't mean you have to be a daily show, but it does mean you should be producing content daily, I would suggest. Maybe it's a weekly podcast episode, a weekly blog post, a weekly video on YouTube, or maybe even a separate podcast feed, and it can be a very short video. But that right there is 3 different days of content. And on other days, you're posting on social networks, you're tweeting, you're posting to Facebook page, or your personal profile. You're participating in other groups and communities. You're putting out your content out there. That makes you stand out because your name will be more and more associated with that thing that you're talking about as you're engaging with the community, finding a community, going where people are, and you're trying to be everywhere you can be well. So those are the top 2 ways to make your podcast stand out: your quality and the amount of your content.
That's awesome. That's some great advice right there. So can you give us kind of some insight into what are these top shows doing in terms of how many downloads are these top shows in iTunes getting, and what kind of potential is out there for exposure?
Potential is the entire world, really. But realistically, right now, we're about a quarter of the United States population has listened to a podcast within the last week, and that is a pretty big number, or they've listened to podcasts fairly recently. We need to get that number higher, but do imagine a quarter of the United States. That is a very big number. And for any niche, there could be an even larger following than that. So your potential is almost limitless. But right now we do have the limit of how many people are familiar with how to listen to a podcast, subscribe to it, and such. So each niche and industry is going to have its own limits and targets. For example, Serial hit, I think it was 5 million downloads in the first month. That's a really high level, but they're very general content that appeals to a massive audience who likes to be entertained, and it was highly produced content. But then look at a podcast like Pat Flynn's Smart Passive Income. It started out hitting number 1, number 2, number 3, bouncing around in those rankings in iTunes when it had 10, 15,000 downloads per episode. And that is still a big audience size, but that gives you an idea of how a more niche market, you can be the top of that more niche market with a smaller audience. Or like with our Once Upon a Time podcast, we're at a few thousand downloads per episode, and we're the top podcast. Now, there are many more people who watch Once Upon a Time than just a few thousand, so our market potential is huge. It's just we need to reach those people and find the people who enjoy the TV show and then get them listening to a podcast.
Gotcha. So when you talk about like that one show with excuse me, that one show with like 5 million downloads in the first month, was that like one episode or was that a whole bunch of episodes at the same time?
That was a bunch of episodes, so you can't say 5 million downloads per episode. And that was Serial, NPR's, or the new podcast that's gotten all of that attention in late 2014 because of it, all of the great people that came over with all of their experience from NPR and This American Life and such. So it was highly produced, highly published, and highly promoted, high quality content that they were presenting, and it hooked people in. A lot of people were saying, did you hear what's happening in Serial? There were even podcasts about the Serial podcast, like fan podcasts about another podcast, just like they do with TV shows. Serial made a big jump there in popularity for podcasting, and a lot of people jumped on because it was so engaging and such great content. And that's how they reached a massive audience. But most of us as individuals aren't going to be able to reach that kind of massive audience because we don't have that kind of budget. We don't have that kind of leverage. But we can still reach a really big audience and influence the world for good.
Absolutely. So I know you're also a pro in podcast SEO and really understand, how you actually get people to find your show in iTunes. So can you walk us through some of the basics of SEO for podcasters, which is basically search engine optimization, and how do you get people, when they search for a word or a keyword or something about your show in iTunes, how do you get them to actually find it?
Yeah, so I was holding off on this one because I knew we'd talk about this. This is another way to make your podcast stand out, is by having more search engine optimization. And I did a whole 10-hour, well, it's currently 10 hours, it will probably expand to more 10-hour SEO podcasters over at theaudacitytopodcast.com/SEO. But here are the most important parts of this, the key and the core of this. The most important text. It matters to Google as a website search engine. It matters to social networks because those titles that you create for your episodes are what are shared out by default to Twitter, to Facebook, Google+, all of these social networks. And in iTunes, your titles are one of only 2 text fields that are searched. Your title tags, and that is your title for your overall show, as well as the titles for your individual episodes, and your author tags for your overall show and your individual episodes. So how to leverage this would be to figure out what the relevant keywords are for your show, and don't try and stuff them all in your show level title, like the name of your overall podcast series, but try to cover these as different topics as in episodes, and take some of those top level keywords and use them in your title. For example, I have a clean comedy podcast, the one that I started back in 2007. It's called The Ramen Noodle. No one is going to search iTunes for the ramen noodle unless they know they're looking for the ramen noodle. But no one is going to search for the ramen noodle when they're just thinking, I want to find a clean comedy podcast. I guess I'll type in the ramen noodle. That it doesn't fit for them. So no one will be searching for that. Instead, they might search for clean comedy podcast or clean comedy. So in our title, what we've done is it's named the ramen noodle hyphen clean comedy podcast. So we've included those keywords in there so that it makes it much more searchable. The same thing like with our Once Upon a Time podcast, its name is technically Once Podcast, but in iTunes we put it as Once hyphen Once Upon a Time podcast. So if you search for Once Upon a Time podcast, it shows up. So use these keywords that are relevant and great titles for your overall show as well as for your individual episodes. And then also the other text field that matters is the author tag to iTunes. That's what matters. And this is where you can put, not spamming it full of keywords, like treating it like a subtitle, as many people in iTunes will do, but still treat it as an author tag. Put a name first, but then you could put a title after that name. For example, with the Audacity podcast, my author tag can say Daniel J. Lewis, comma, expert on how to podcast. So there I've given myself a title, but I've also used those keywords, how to podcast, as part of my subtitle. I'm not spamming it to say how to podcast, podcasting, WordPress, Audacity, and all of these other keywords in there by making it relevant and appropriate. I'm also not putting other people's names in there because that wouldn't be appropriate. Even though I might have had them as guests in the past, it would be inappropriate for me to put them as authors for the overall podcast. You can, however, use them as authors of individual episodes. So, for example, if I interview Chris Brogan, I can put in the author tag Daniel J. Lewis, comma, Chris Brogan, comma, internet marketing expert, or something like that. So I'm including a couple keywords, not stuffing it, but I'm also including the actual important, relevant information.
Awesome. And so is that, and you're talking about the individual episode tags for your shows, is that embedded in the MP3 file, or is that what you actually post on your website?
That's a great question. The ID3 tags, so what you embed in the MP3 file, actually don't matter whatsoever to your search engine optimization. Those matter for compatibility, like with certain Android devices or older devices playing your episodes, and sometimes computers. But for your SEO and how your podcast appears in iTunes, the default place for that would be wherever you're creating the post for this episode. So if you're using your WordPress website to create your RSS feed for your podcast, and you've used PowerPress, which is what I recommended earlier, then by default, the title of that WordPress post will be the title that appears in iTunes. As of PowerPress version 6.0, there's a feature you can enable that gives you the ability to overwrite the title as it appears in iTunes. So, for example, on my website, I could have a title, and at the end of the title, I say, podcast episode number 5, or I have the name of the podcast, but something so that when people are on my website, they see that this is a podcast episode instead of a blog post. And then in iTunes, that's unnecessary because the context makes it obvious this is a podcast episode, so it doesn't have to say podcast episode. It could just say episode, or it could just say number. So I can overwrite that title through the advanced features in PowerPress. If you're using something else to create your RSS feed, then you'd look there at how you're creating your post title, and that's most likely the title that would appear in iTunes for that episode.
Gotcha. Okay, so what about the author tags? How do you edit the author tags?
Same thing with PowerPress. By default, it will use the author of the blog post, but you can override that by enabling the extra field inside of PowerPress so that you can add the specific iTunes tag for the author. If you're using Libsyn to create your RSS feed, you actually have to add a little piece of code to every post for some additional tags. It's a little bit more complicated, and I do get into it in my course, but the simplest way to do it is if you're using PowerPress to just enable the iTunes author tag, and then you have that there for every time that you add an episode, you can change and write in whatever text you need to for the author tag.
Awesome. Some great tips so far. This is amazing, Daniel. Thank you.
You're welcome. Here's something, though, that's going to be a shocker for some people who have worked so hard to write the perfect description for your podcast, including all of these keywords. Note that I said there were only 2 fields that iTunes currently searches. That's as of early 2015. That's your titles and your author tags, not your description at all, not your keywords, not your subtitles. These other pieces of text help for when people get to your podcast, for the human connection here, for a human to see why should they listen to this episode or why should they subscribe to that podcast. But this doesn't help in making your podcast more findable for keywords. What also helps you really stick out in search is if you have great looking podcast cover art, because people might type in a search, and if they type in, for example, productivity, and they see several different podcasts that bring up that result, which one of those images stands out and which one communicates the relevance to productivity the most? That's the one they'll more likely click on and go into to see the title, the description, the episodes, and all of that. Your thumbnail for your podcast, that cover art, is larger than the title is in most searches. And in fact, your title is truncated, so you might not be able to show all of your title. So make that image really stand out, and that helps people find your podcast more and makes your podcast stand out above everyone else. You could even do a search for your podcast or relevant searches that you want people to find your podcast with and see how are the other podcast cover arts designed and how could you make yours different so that it stands out. If everyone else is using reds and blues, maybe you should use green or something like that where you are different, you stand out in some way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I mean, on the show, we always talk about, cover design, or often talk about cover design for authors. And, it's so important to have a really professionally designed cover, because otherwise people are not going to click on your listing on Amazon. They're not going to buy your book. And it's the same way with, podcasts. It's the same way with Facebook and Twitter and any website. People love images. People are attracted to images. And if your images, look like your neighbor who's a 12-year-old kid, designed it in Paint in 5 minutes, and it's not going to convert nearly as well as if you have something that looks really, really professional and clean.
Exactly. So this is worth paying for. There are many different places you can get images designed. I design images, or you could go through like 99 Designs, or maybe you know a graphic designer, but don't hire your neighbor unless your neighbor is a professional graphic designer. And in that case, do hire your neighbor.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So do you do any kind of split testing or analytics with your shows or with your cover designs or anything like that?
Yeah, I've done some. It's very difficult, though, in the podcasting space to do split testing because the dynamics of a podcast are very different. For example, I might split test a call to action inside of the audio of my podcast, but how do I measure that call to action? I would have to measure it by how many people take action on that. I can't measure it by how many downloads I get because people download it before they hear the call to action. So the call to action doesn't influence the downloads, the title does. So I could do some tests on the title, but again, there are certain caveats to podcasting that wouldn't help as much because you'll always receive the majority of your downloads in the first couple days or few days. So if I change the title on day 1 and then day 2 and then day 3, so I try 3 different titles, it's not going to give me good results because most of my downloads will happen in the first day anyway, to subscribers anyway. But you can try split tests like what you share out to social media. What title works best when you share it out on Twitter or Facebook? What photo works best when you share it out to Twitter or Facebook? Try these different tests. And it's because of the way social media works, where people are online at many different times of the day. There could be all kinds of factors going into something. So whatever you feel like testing, repeat the test. But what I've seen that works really well is give people a reason to do things, whether it be a call to action in your podcast, whether it be rating and reviewing you in iTunes, or maybe sharing a link out on Twitter. Like if I just say, new episode available, and then the URL, that says nothing about the episode. It says nothing about why people should click on that episode and listen. But if I say, check out our new episode about such and such, that's better. I'm calling them to take action. Or if I just come up with a great title, that's really the best thing. Like if I say 5 amazing ways that you can grow your podcast audience overnight, that's a lot more interesting, and so it compels people to click on it. And that's the kind of stuff that I like to experiment with, is to see which message gets the most clicks and at what time of the day and such. But because the internet's a living organism, it's really hard to do this without a massive team and lots of content to experiment with.
Gotcha. So tell us about your team. I mean, do you have a big team of people that work with you? Is it just you all by yourself? How's that work?
It is primarily just me. I'm the one that creates the podcast content for most of my shows that I personally host, the Clean Comedy, the podcast about podcasting, and our Once Upon a Time podcast. And with the Once Upon a Time podcast, I do have co-hosts, and they bring their own approach to the content and their own ideas as well. But for like the Audacity to podcast, I write my own show notes ahead of time, then I record the episode, but then I pass off the recording to a virtual assistant who is producing the episode for me. For our Once Upon a Time podcast, we each prepare our notes ahead of time. We come together, we record, then we pass off the recording to our producer who pieces it together. While we're recording, we're also live streaming, and we have someone taking notes for us, writing the show notes, because our individual notes won't make much sense to anyone outside of the world, and it doesn't help with SEO. So we have someone basically writing a blog post for us based on what we talk about in the podcast as we're talking about it. So that makes then for high quality content on the website, much better content than just a straight transcription. And that helps us then with our search engine optimization. So that's two people then. And then I also do have my own personal virtual assistant that helps out in different ways, but it's not necessarily a position that every week helps us with the podcast. It might be something like scheduling the YouTube live events or emailing celebrities for us or some individual tasks like that.
Gotcha. So you actually email celebrities for your I'm guessing for your like once upon a time show.
Yeah, we have had a couple of the celebrities from the show on our podcast before, and we plan to do that with more. And it's a lot of fun, too. Our fans really enjoy it. And it's a great way to grow the podcast, too, because if the celebrity enjoyed the interview or they have a team behind them and their agent thought the interview was good, then frequently from that celebrity's social profile, they will mention us and say, hey, check out my interview I did with this podcast. And that brings a lot of their fans who may have never heard about us over to us. And that's one of the really cool things about doing interviews. And that's why a lot of people want to do interviews.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm imagining you get a huge bump in downloads from having a celebrity tweet or mention your show for sure.
Yeah, and that's where having high quality content that's highly produced or well produced and well presented really matters, because if that stranger comes in, checks out the podcast, and they enjoy it, then they might subscribe to stick around for more.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I'd love to do, and I want to take a little step back here from the conversation that we've had and kind of step back into the mindset of the actual podcast listeners and podcast subscribers. Because one of the things I found really helpful in business is really getting a really in-depth understanding of who is your listener, who is your customer, and how do they actually interact with your product. So can you kind of walk us back and take us through kind of the action steps that an actual podcast listener takes when they're checking out shows, when they're looking for shows, when they're subscribing to shows? What does that look like?
Well, I'll describe it from my perspective and representing many people out there, and I know there are exceptions to this, but when I want to find a new podcast to listen to, unless I know exactly the topic I want to listen to, most likely I'm going to hear that podcast mentioned from someone else, or I will meet that person somewhere because I go to lots of events. And that's the way it works for many other listeners too. It's not that they're getting on iTunes and searching for, I want to subscribe to a podcast, I don't know what to listen to, I'll just find something. Most of them, if they're listening to a podcast, will find another podcast to listen to based on the recommendation or mention in a podcast they're already listening to. It's word of mouth. That's the most powerful thing. That's how podcasters reach a larger audience. That's how people who never listened to podcasts before are more likely to start listening to podcasts, is by word of mouth. Someone they trust saying, hey, have you listened to this podcast? What, you mean you don't know how to listen to a podcast? Let me show you. And let me show you my favorite show you should check out. Word of mouth is the most powerful thing. So the podcast consumer out there isn't thinking, how do I find a podcast? More likely they're thinking, how do I subscribe to this podcast? Or I've heard about this podcast thing. How do I actually get it? Because I want to listen to this particular podcast I've heard something about. And I think for us as podcasters, that's what we need to make easy for people, is make it as easy as visit website, press play, and also to make it easy for people to subscribe, like being in iTunes and popular podcast apps for Android and other platforms, so that you can tell people, maybe even by making a video, to show them how you subscribe to your own podcast.
Awesome. That's great advice. So I know you just mentioned, having the shows playable on your website, and also people can listen on iTunes and on their phones and so forth. So what kind of breakdown do you see in terms of how many people are listening to shows actually inside of iTunes, like on their iPhone or iPod, versus on the website?
The primary dominant player by far for podcast consumption is Apple-based, and that is either iTunes on Windows or OS X, or an iOS device like an iPod Touch, an iPad, or an iPhone, and heavily iPhone, because that makes it very accessible to consume the podcast episodes. So that's the biggest, and I'll give you some numbers, at least from my own network. I'm looking at the iTunes ecosystem, which would be desktop iTunes, as well as the podcast app for iOS, represent the majority of devices out there. Podcast app for iOS, I'm looking at, looks to be about 30%, or here it is, 12.5% for the podcast app for iOS. For iTunes, 26.5%. For just an iPhone browser, someone visiting the website on their iPhone and pressing play, that is 15.4%. Stitcher is in there, as well as web browsers are really high. So putting it just simply, your biggest consumption places will be something that's powered by iTunes and your website. Everything else will still help, but it will be much lower in the list. Those two places are the most important places to make sure it's easy to get to your podcast: the iTunes directory and the podcast app for iOS, as well as your own website.
Awesome. That's awesome. So how do you actually make money from a podcast? I mean, I know you've got all these different shows. Is it something you're making a lot of money from? Is it something you can monetize? How do you actually, how do you survive as a podcaster?
There are many different ways to make money from your podcast, and it comes down to either you're promoting something of your own or you're promoting something from someone else. You can make the most money when you're promoting something of your own. That could be a one-on-one service, like I offer one-on-one consulting, and that's where the majority of my income has come from in the past couple of years, where I teach people how to launch or improve their own podcasts. But if you can come out with a product or some kind of service that doesn't require your direct amount of hours, that's when you can really make almost an unlimited amount of income. For example, I worked with a client who has a $7,000 training program. So all it takes for them to make $7,000 is one person to purchase that course. It might take 2 podcast episodes or 3 podcast episodes for that one person to decide to purchase that course. But when they do, they've made $7,000. For that same podcast to make that much money from just a typical sponsor who pays based on how many thousand downloads, or what we call CPM, then they would have to have at least an audience of about 15,000 listeners per episode, and they'd have to have episodes for at least several weeks before they'd make up for that. So is it one customer or thousands and thousands of people that you're getting paid very little for? So I really recommend, if you want to make money from your podcast, try to make a product or a service that you can offer. Not everyone can do that, and that's fine. Other ways that you can make money, though, are by promoting something else outside of yourself. Like it's an affiliate program, such as Amazon affiliate, or Audible, or your web hosting affiliate, something like that, where when you send people to this other site, you get paid from that. You could also have products made for people to represent your podcast, like t-shirts or hats, hoodies or mugs or something like that. Donations can also be good. There are podcasters like Tom Merritt that are making a lot of money every month just from donations through a platform like Patreon, or there's also Joyride, and there are other platforms allowing podcasters to make money from their audience. With our Once Upon a Time podcast, I'm amazed at how much people will give to the podcast. Because get this, it's a free TV show, 45 minutes or an hour basically per week of the TV show. that they watch for free. Then they listen to our podcast, which is sometimes up to 3 hours of content for a 45-minute TV show. And our podcast is completely free. They join our forums, they chat with the community. That's completely free. They're getting all this completely free content and community from us. But some of our audience is donating more than $100 per month for a free podcast about a free TV show. They're donating just because they enjoy it and they want to see us continue. So we have all of our expenses covered and then some, as donations are coming in through PayPal, through our website, through Patreon, Joyride, all of these different platforms. The thing is to make it easy for the audience to purchase the product, click on your affiliate link to donate to you. But whatever it is, pick something that fits you, your business models, and your perspectives. Like for me, the majority of my income is coming from the solutions I create for podcasters, either one-on-one or products and services like my SEO for Podcasters course that I've created, took me months to create. Now that I've created it, it's sitting out there, and every time someone buys it, I make more money, and I didn't have to work any extra to make that money. It like 1,000 people could buy it today, or one person could buy it today, and it makes no difference to my amount of time that I have to spend on it today.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, I mean, how do you do all this promotion though, and without kind of sounding too salesy or turning off your audience? Because I know, I mean, I listen to a lot of podcast shows, and some of the shows like I love, but like I just have to skip the first 10 minutes because I know it's just all promotional. To me, just a waste of time, right? And so for my show, personally, for this show, I try to keep a bare minimum on the intro and extra, so it's usually like a minute or less in the intro and extra, so that there's not a lot of wasted time. We can just get right into the meat of the content and really add value to people. But how do you balance that, and what do you see as some kind of trends and things to look out for?
Well, you got it. You're doing the right thing, and that is give them the content they came for as quickly as possible. Yes, there can be this thing where you're enticing them to stay for the content, but first they need to hear your commercial. And that's the way people do it, like the salesmen do it at the grocery stores, where they say, I'm going to give you this free item. Just stick around for my 5-minute demonstration while I try to sell you something, and then I'll give you this free, pretty much worthless item. And that works in person, but in a podcast, we have a fast forward button. We can skip the advertising. So I really recommend don't put the advertising at the beginning. Hook them with the content. Jump into your amazing high value content as quickly as possible. That's the hook. And then have your calls to action either in the middle, so you're at some point you're taking a break from your content or interrupting it in a way that's smooth, a smooth transition, and you insert your ad there. And then you can also do it at the end. So after you've earned their respect, they know, like, and trust you because of the good content you're giving, then you ask them to do something or tell them about something cool they can take advantage of. And sometimes you can have a lot of fun with this. Like with our Once Upon a Time podcast, there's a specific spot in the middle of the episode where we transition from talking about one storyline to another, and that's usually where I thank our sponsors. And when it comes around to that time, I'm always looking for a clever way to segue into talking about our sponsors. Like it could be that we're talking about the goose that laid the golden egg, and then I might say, hey, speaking of golden eggs, I want to thank some people who sent us golden eggs and made this podcast possible. So I transition into it. It's even come to the point where people are expecting this whenever I say speaking of or something like that. They enjoy it. They're enjoying the interruptions. Also look at the guys from Film Riot, an online video show that talks about how to create your own movies and videos and such. They have a lot of fun with their sponsors, where sometimes they'll play games promoting their sponsors. They're extremely creative, and their sponsorship spot is entertaining. And because it's entertaining, it also makes it more prevalent. Like I know right away who their sponsor is based on certain funny things that they've done in the past. So you can make the sponsorship entertaining, or just make sure that you're providing value before you're asking people to do something. And that's the most important thing.
That's awesome. That's brilliant advice. And yeah, I like what you said about making it entertaining, not making it like a normal ad. I think ads are changing a lot. I mean, they've changed so much now with the internet, but I think people are tired of being kind of talked to, and they want more of an interactive, something valuable, something entertaining, like you just mentioned. And I think that those are the kind of ads that are going to stick out, and those are the kind of ads that people are going to remember and actually care about, because I don't mind, like if I'm listening to your show on podcasting and you tell me about, hey Tom, here's this awesome tool that I use as a podcaster, here's our sponsor, and here's what it does for you. I don't mind that if it's valuable. But if it's something, completely boring or just not at all targeting my interests and my needs and my wants, then I'm not going to listen to it.
Right. You're providing the value first. And if that sponsor is somehow relevant, or whatever it is that you're trying to promote is relevant, that's even more valuable. Like every time I do an episode of the Audacity podcast where I'm providing great value that also somehow, coincidentally sometimes, ties in with a product or service I have, and I mention that product or service, sales always go up for that thing. It could be my WordPress plugin or my course or my podcast reviews or anything like that. Or sometimes it's an affiliate thing where I'm talking about, maybe it's why you need a mixer. So I'm providing all this value about why you should have a mixer for your podcast. And then I say, by the way, here are some of the mixers I recommend. You can see the links in the show notes. People will click those links and purchase the mixers through my affiliate links, and I get paid for that. Like in 2014, I think I made about $7,000 or $8,000 just from Amazon affiliates. And a lot of those are pieces of equipment that I did specifically recommend and endorse in some way. Not where I told people, buy this through my affiliate link or buy. It's I provided value and then gave them a link to take action. And that link does happen to help me.
Mm-hmm. That's so awesome. And that's what I love about podcasts, what I love about the internet is it allows us to educate people. And I know, $8,000 in Amazon commissions is actually a lot because they only pay you like 4 to 8%. So that's a lot of money in sales. But what I love about that and what is so cool to me about that is that that's problems you're solving for people. Like if you tell someone has a problem, like I used to have problems with my mics. Like I couldn't find a mic that was good. I had all these horrible problems, and all it took for me was like listening to a blog, reading a blog post, and someone said this is a great mic, and I bought it. I probably used their Amazon affiliate link. But like that's you're solving problems for people when you're educating people, and that's why I think podcasts are so powerful, and why you can make money from it by simply by educating, like you said, by adding value. It's not about being salesy or being pitchy. It's just adding value to people and educating people. Because if someone knew the absolute best tools they needed for a podcast, they'd go out and buy them right away if that's what they wanted. So it's just educating your audience about what they actually need to achieve the goals that they have.
What's awesome is to see sometimes my audience will say, hey, I want to buy this thing. Would you please give me an affiliate link? Because they know, like, and trust me. They want to support what I'm doing. Or many other podcasters who have said, I really appreciate the content you're putting out. I wish I could buy something from you. Or either I don't have money or I haven't found anything I need to buy yet. So there are awesome opportunities like that when you're creating that high-value content that people will engage with and start to know, like, and trust you because of what you're putting out there.
Yeah, that's awesome. So do you have like a resources link on your website with just one page with like all the different tools and stuff that you recommend?
I have worked at different times to build that. I do kind of have one, but it's not a very good one right now. And I know that my income would increase if I create a resources page like that, especially now that I am a licensed reseller, so I can purchase equipment at wholesale and resell it then at retail and provide extra value to people. But a resources page on your site is a great thing to do if you want to try and make money, because people will be consuming your site, and you might have affiliate links in individual episodes or posts and such, but they're kind of scattered all over. If you could make a single resources page or getting started or a gear page or whatever fits for your particular niche, and that's where you can recommend things. And also recommend what you use. I'm not just saying be familiar with the things that you recommend. That should be common sense, that you recommend what you actually can recommend, what you have experience with. But some people will want to just know, what microphone do you use? Even if you're not into talking about microphones or gear or anything like that, people will still want to know, I like the sound of your voice. What microphone do you use? Because I want to buy it. So be transparent about some of that stuff. And it's cool then for people to see that, and that can often lead to sales for you.
That's a great idea. I never thought of that. I'm totally going to do that like right after the show. I'm going to go and add that to the podcast website about like, what mic I use and the tools and software and stuff like that. But I think that's such a brilliant point, and I think what it does and how it really adds tons of value is it really provides transparency. Like you're showing your audience, like this is me. I'm just a regular guy like you. This is this is my mic. This is my software. It's not that complicated, because I think a lot of people, when they look at, successful podcaster, author, or blogger, entrepreneur, they think like you're on a pedestal almost, and it's not that way at all. Like we're just regular people having a conversation. We love what we do, and we're blessed that we get to do what we love to do. But I think that's so cool when you can just show people like, here's what I do, here's how I do it. If you want to follow me or follow my model or use any of these tools, go ahead and feel free to do that. And I think that's really inspiring when you can, follow someone you love, who you love what they do, and just see, okay, here's how they're doing it, and model that yourself.
Yeah, and you see this happening all over the place in the celebrity realm too. People want to own the same things that the celebrities own. Sometimes it's just because of the association that they like to have. Sometimes it's because they want to identify in some way with them, or they want some kind of level of success similar to them. Like, what camera do you use if you're a photographer? Well, other people will want to use that too, because they might be thinking, my camera doesn't take good photos. He takes good photos. Yes, there is the thing about you really need to have the skill behind the tool. You can't just buy the same paintbrush that Leonardo da Vinci owned and then be just as good as he is at art. But there is still a little bit to owning the same kind of tool as others.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's kind of like the future of commerce. I look at like everything I buy today, like at least, I don't know what percentage, but I would say at least half of it has got to be stuff that is just word of mouth from the internet. Podcasts, blogs. Yeah, and a lot of it's word of mouth from people I know and people I talk to, but even more and more now, it's coming from online, from social media, from websites and podcasts and YouTube, of products or services that I hear about that just I'm like, oh, I want that, and I'll go buy it online.
And
And I think that's really the future.
It's from people you trust, and you trust them because of the content they gave you.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is so powerful. And so you shared just a wealth of wisdom with us today, Daniel. I really, really appreciate it. Anyone listening right now, check out publishingprofitspodcast.com. You can find this episode there. We've got all the show notes, all the links. I know you mentioned like a ton of links and resources today, so we'll have all that there in the show notes. So thank you for that. Before you go, tell us where people can find out more about you and the work that you're doing, Daniel.
Yeah, I teach other people how to launch and improve their own podcasts through either one-on-one consulting or products and services that I create. That's all at theaudacitytopodcast.com, and I'm on Twitter at @theramennoodle.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for this opportunity.